In two recent videos, I discussed the per-mile road user fee pilot program that was buried in the 1,039-page Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act signed into law by President Biden on November 15, 2021. That law requires the U.S. Secretary of Transportation to create a national motor vehicle per-mile user fee pilot program designed to directly charge drivers of all vehicles, not just electric vehicles, based on the number of miles they drive on public roads. Unlike the gas tax, this law will require the government to know how many miles every vehicle travels, and that will be accomplished by tracking where every vehicle drives through the use of smartphone applications, telematics data collected by automakers, and, quote, any other method the Secretary considers appropriate. The Intercept was one of the very few media outlets who warned the public about the huge violation of privacy created by the government keeping track of everywhere people drive. The vast majority of comments left in response to my two videos on this subject were opposed to the government tracking where people drive, but there were a few viewers who genuinely questioned, why would the government want to track where everyone drives? Or what is wrong with a per-mile tax if it replaced the gas tax? In this video, I'm going to answer those questions by explaining the concept of the Overton Window and how both the Indiana General Assembly and Congress have passed laws implementing unpopular ideas by phasing them in pieces over the course of several years. I will then explain what I expect to happen once the infrastructure is in place to implement a per-mile driving tax. I am Dr. Jon Padfield, an engineer turned state representative turned business professor, and this is Business Reform, where we discuss issues at the intersection of business, technology, and society. The Overton Window is a range of public policy options that would be acceptable to the majority of the population at that time. If you consider the existing law as the status quo, you can see there is generally a lot of support for small changes in either direction. But as a new policy proposal moves further away from the status quo in either direction, most people turn against the idea because they view it as too radical or even unthinkable. In practical terms, this means legislators cannot pass a single law that is too big of a change from the status quo without risking career-ending backlash from voters. However, politicians are experts at shifting the Overton window by breaking a radical law into smaller pieces and phasing it in over time. They will pass something that seems reasonable by itself and make it the new policy. Then, what was previously deemed unthinkable by most people look more acceptable because we are already halfway there, and it isn't that far away from the new status quo. Want to see an example of this concept in action? Indiana is known for being a very conservative state, and its Constitution, written in 1851, contained a provision in Article 15, Section 8 that explicitly prohibited gambling. In 1988, 62% of Indiana voters approved a constitutional amendment to repeal Article 15, Section 8 so Indiana could create a state lottery. However, the majority of Indiana voters were still opposed to having casinos in the state. 5 years later, after the constitutional prohibition on gambling was gone, the Indiana General Assembly passed a law allowing riverboat casinos in the state, but they still did not approve land-based casinos because that was still too controversial with the majority of Indiana voters. Then in 2004, the Indiana Legislature passed legislation to allow a riverboat casino to open and operate in the resort town of French Lick, Indiana. Everything was fine except just one minor problem. There are no rivers or lakes anywhere near French Lick, Indiana. I say that was just a minor problem because when there are hundreds of millions of dollars to be made, people get creative, and someone came up with the idea of what became known as the boat in the moat. This image is not photoshopped. A massive riverboat casino was built in a tiny pond about 10 feet longer than the boat, because Indiana law didn't allow land-based casinos. Less than 2 years later, the moat was filled in, and this, quote, riverboat became Indiana's first land-based casino. The moral of the story is it took 20 years from 1988 to 2008 to get land-based casinos in Indiana, and they would have never passed in a single piece of legislation. But a handful of legislators slowly shifted the Overton window by changing the law a little at a time until they reached their ultimate goal. Another example is the federal income tax. The U.S. Constitution, as ratified in 1781, did not allow the federal government to directly tax citizens. In 1894, Congress passed the Income Tax Act of 1894, but this law was struck down the following year by the U.S. Supreme Court. Then, 18 years later, in 1913, the 16th Amendment was ratified, which gave Congress the power to directly tax citizens via an income tax. Congress then immediately passed the Revenue Act of 1913, which created a progressive income tax of 1 to 7% on individuals earning more than $3,000 per year, which in 1913 meant it only applied to roughly the wealthiest 2 or 3% of Americans. Just 31 years later, in 1944, the top marginal income tax rate in the United States was 94%. In 1819, in the case of McCulloch v. Maryland, Chief Justice John Marshall wrote, quote, "The power to tax involves the power to destroy." That was nearly 100 years before the federal income tax was created. Today, the tax laws passed by Congress, known as the Internal Revenue Code, also known as Title 26 of the U.S. Code, is approximately 2,600 pages long, and there are an additional 70,000 pages of Treasury regulations and relevant case law. Once the income tax was created, Congress started using it to control people with a complicated, ever-changing series of monetary rewards and punishments, such as tax credits for spending your money in ways Congress wants you to spend your money. Congress has also created luxury taxes for spending your money on things they decided you don't really need, such as expensive cars, furs, and jewelry. Congress has also passed a, quote, sin tax on alcohol and tobacco products and excise taxes on tanning bed services because Congress wanted to discourage people from using tanning beds. The point is that even before it was known as the Overton Window, legislators have been practicing the idea of incrementally introducing legislation to minimize public backlash. I know these people. I served with some of them when I was in the Indiana Legislature. They never show their hand by telling you up front what their ultimate goal is. They just phase it in one piece at a time. So what's next once Congress gets their per-mile driving tax they want so desperately? I want to stress this is my opinion based on my knowledge of the people involved and how they operate. I am not aware of any legislation that has been introduced yet to do these things, but I fully expect to see some or all of the following. First, just like the federal income tax rate increases for people earning more, I expect the per-mile driving tax to become a progressive tax, meaning the more miles you drive, the higher the per-mile tax will be. This will be passed under the guise of saving the planet. Second, this tax could easily vary by time of day and or destination. New York has already implemented, quote, congestion pricing in the form of a toll on vehicles entering Lower Manhattan, and the cost of that toll varies depending on the time of day when you enter into the business district. Once the federal government is tracking where and when you drive, they could easily charge you more at certain locations or certain times of the day to encourage you to avoid driving when and where they don't want you to drive. And speaking of driving when the government doesn't want you to drive, the per-mile tax could also easily be doubled or tripled or more for miles driven during a government-ordered lockdown. I sincerely hope the per-mile tax pilot program is completely repealed before any of this happens, but this is what I expect to happen over the next few years if the per-mile driving tax is implemented. But what do you think? Do you think I'm being paranoid, or do you agree my predictions are reasonable and on brand for Congress? Do you have any additional predictions of where the per-mile tax will lead? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section below. If you appreciate this type of content, please give this video a like and consider subscribing. And as always, thank you for watching.